All right, everyone, we'll go ahead and get started. I just want to welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today, Maximize Value from Your ITSM Transformation. My name is Alexander Mazurek with Quint Wellington Redwood, and I'll be your host during this session. At this time, I'd like to point out the questions panel that's on the control panel of your GoToWebinar screen. Feel free to ask a question during any portion of this webinar, and we're going to have a designated portion after the presentation in which we will address your questions, and Adrian will answer them for all to hear. And just so you know, and just in case you're pressed on time, we're going to have a recording sent out of this webinar after the fact to everyone who had registered. So if you need to leave early, don't be afraid to. You will be able to have access to the rest of the information. So now I just want to give a brief introduction to our organization. As mentioned, we're Quint Wellington Redwood. We are a 100% independent management consulting firm. We were established in 1992 over in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. We are now completely global. We have over 250 consultants. And as I mentioned, we are in 49 countries worldwide on just about every single continent. Our core business practices include sourcing, architecture, governments, lean IT, and IT service management, like in this webinar. We have been for the last few years one of the top global advisors on sourcing and governments practices, and we continue to be a recognized thought leader in the areas of IT service management and lean IT. So we have a philosophy in the way that we work. We like to focus upon people, process, and technology, and that really brings us to our tagline here, which is really we like to maximize business value with IT by transforming the people, processes, and technology within organizations. So now, without any further delay, I would like to introduce our presenter today, Adrian.
Thank you, Alex. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. Good evening. My name is Adrian van der Rijken. I'm one of the principal consultants with Quint Wellington Redwood, and I will be talking a little bit about maximizing your value of ITSM today. So a couple of things. We will, first of all, talk about some of the challenges that we will face that would stop us, to prevent us from being successful or get the most out of our ITSM implementation. After we talked a little bit about the challenges, then the biggest part of our presentation will then actually talk about the ingredients. What do we need to do to mitigate some of those challenges and really get the most and the best out of our ITSM program? And like Alex already said, at the end we will have a Q&A session to answer some of the questions that you may have. So when we decide to embark on an ITSM journey to start implementing ITSM, IT service management, we typically get all excited. The organization gets all excited that we are going to do this. But what stops us from being successful? What are some of the things that really hinder us or will become a roadblock? And I will list a couple of things. It's not a complete list. It's not everything that potentially could go wrong or could stop us. But these are some of the things that I have seen over the 20 years that I've been involved now in ITSM. So vision and objectives. The vision of an organization, a clear vision and a clear objective of what we want to achieve as an organization, as an IT group. And not every organization has that. And when we don't have that, it becomes very difficult to link some of those values that we're trying to achieve to this program. The governance in an organization, how are we managing, how are we making decisions? Those type of things are not always fully established or very soundly established in an organization. Stakeholder management is a very difficult thing for most IT organizations. So when we talk about ITSM programs and implementation of best practices in ITIL, we are very internally focused usually, and we forget about even the people or the groups within IT that are impacted by this, and specifically by the business. The business is impacted in one way, shape, or form by all the things that we do within ITSM. So we need to manage those stakeholders through communication and training, and we often forget about that. Project team dynamics. We tend to think that we are very social and very good with working with other people in the organization, and mostly that is true. But when we get into an ITSM program where, and of course it depends whether we have a very localized implementation or a regional or global implementation, what we see is that although we try to be nice to each other, then some of the politics start playing into the program, and some of the cultural differences, and the fact that we're just people. We're not all the same. We're not a computer program that responds the same to the input that is given to us. But paying attention to the project team dynamics is very important. In the end, we all have to work towards the same result. Then resource workload visibility. Not in every organization the project team is assigned 100% to the project. So it's very tough sometimes to identify what are all the other tasks that people work on. So when will they actually be available? How much will they be available? And how is that availability going to impact the program itself? Project tracking, it seems to be simple and straightforward, and yet I think maybe because of its simplicity, not a lot of organizations do this very well. Visibility of all projects within an organization. The ITSM program is typically not the only program that runs in the department or in your organization. So we have to identify what are all the projects, what are all the programs that are currently running or going to be running in the near future that potentially impact our program, or the ones that we will impact. So we can set some parameters up front, and we can also establish some communication lines to those other projects and programs, and we can align ourselves and not step on each other's toes and be in each other's way. And then we talked about an organization having vision and objectives, but also going lower level for the program itself. What are we really trying to achieve? When I ask people, like, why are we doing this program? Why are you doing this project? Too often I hear because we want to implement ITIL or we want to implement best practices. That's what we're going to do, but why are we doing this? Are we doing this to reduce cost? Are we going to do this to improve the quality or increase customer satisfaction? So what are really the key elements? So then we can start tying also the design of our processes, and everything that we do, all the activities can be tied to what we want to achieve and not just implement generically in ITSM and ITIL processes. The bigger picture is not always very clear to everybody in the project. So we see people in the project just focusing on their part, whether that is configuring of the tool, analyzing the business processes, but we then fail to inform or fail to see why are we doing all of this? Why is the tool configured the way it is? So showing the bigger picture to the project and the stakeholders is often very important to give them a better understanding of what's going on. The assessment is typically a challenge for that I see for most organizations. Not that we don't do an assessment, but it's not necessarily getting the attention that I believe it needs to have. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the next part of the presentation. Risk management is another component. What I see most organizations do is risk listing. So they have a list of risks, but they're not managing it. And we typically wait until a risk turns into an issue, and then we'll start addressing it. But that takes a lot more effort to handle those than try to mitigate the risk itself. So that is one of the challenges that we see as well. Communication is maybe one that resonates with most of us. We're as people are not very good in communicating about the things that we do, that our program or project is doing. We send messages, and we have multiple electronic media to do so, and we receive messages, but we're not very good in processing and acknowledging messages. So communication is typically a very big issue in most organizations. Another thing we forget to focus on is the return on investment of the initial program phases. We will face people that are resistant, that don't understand, and people that are busy with just doing their daily jobs, trying to keep the shop open. So if we don't, in the initial program phases, where they have provided us with resources, where they're providing time to us, to execute some of these activities, if we don't show them what the return on investment of that is, give them a good feeling and a perception of, hey, there's something in it for me. If we don't show those benefits in the initial program phases, we see that they will typically drop off as we go along. If it takes too long for them to see how is this going to help me, then they will just go back to what they were doing before, because that is for them important initially. Then there's two primary major, the communication was already one, but two other primary challenges that we have is the learning curve, and that has all to do with the training of people, getting them to the right level of skills at the right time, and the fact that people have to get used to the new environment, to your new tool and your new processes. And sometimes that takes for some people a couple of weeks, for some people it takes a couple of months. If we don't make sure that we understand that and that we incorporate that into our plans, then we typically see in a project that we tend to make changes too fast. We think that there's a process issue or there's a tool issue. And a lot of times it's just let people just settle in, let them play with it for a little bit, and then they will get used to it, then they will adopt it and accept what they're doing, and it will run smoothly. The other primary thing is the resistance. That is a major challenge in most organizations. People by default resist. People like to stay in their comfort zone. So how can we break that resistance? What do we need to do? Then also attention to convergence and integration. And what that means is how we will converge processes that are already existing in the organization. When we implement ITSM, when we do ITIL implementation, and even maybe introducing a new tool, a lot of things are going to change. Processes are going to change. So what is the methodology to converge that? And what are the things that we have out there that are not going to be replaced, but we need to integrate with the new environment we're creating? That you want to basically make sure that you have a good idea of what that is up front, and not try to find out as we go along during the design of the process or the transition. Because then we just don't have the time for that, and we create a pressure for our project that we typically cannot handle. So make everything clear as much as possible up front. Then there's IT benefits. And it is not so much that we don't think about IT benefits, but when we have these generic IT benefits that we talked about earlier, like cost reduction, customer satisfaction increase, we also need to make them very specific, and that part we sometimes forget. Like, what are then the critical success factors for a program? How do we translate those objectives, those benefits, and critical success factors? What are then the key performance indicators, and how are we going to measure those? And how will we then tie activities in our program to achieve those specific IT benefits? And when we forget those for IT, we clearly forget them very often for the business benefits. So again, we're very often very internally focused and forget that at the end of the day, we are in support of the business. So how is the business benefiting of this from this, and how are we going to track that and measure that? Something that most organizations, I can almost say all organizations are, is that they're a little bit too opportunistic. They're not in touch with reality, as I call it, when it comes to how much effort does it take to implement ITIL processes, to run an ITSM program. How much time does it take to transform processes, the tooling, and the people? So we're putting a lot of pressure on an organization by setting the target date just too close to the start of the project. So a good dose of being realistic and having a good idea of what all the effort is that needs to happen. When we do that up front, we can at least manage the expectations a lot better during the project. And then last but not least, the attitude, what we call the attitude, behavior, and culture of the organization. An ITSM program typically leads to a reorganizing of your department. And people in different positions, we have to work differently. So the culture has to change. Now, culture on itself is not changeable unless we change the individuals that make up that culture. So we have to change people's behavior and attitude. And that management of change often is under underestimated the effort that goes for that, and it ties back to communication, it ties back to the learning curve and all those elements. So this is a very important component to consider. Now those were, again, and not an all-being list of the issues that we run into, but it's a list of things that I have seen most frequently in programs like this that I run into. So what we're going to talk about now is then what can we do to mitigate some of these risks, or at least reduce the impact of some of these challenges. And again, this is not a golden bullet list. It is are some examples of how I have done these, and some of my colleagues have done these in the programs that we run, and that have proven to be successful. Again, doesn't mean that it's the only way to make it better, but these work. So we try to apply these with every implementation that we're basically involved with. So first of all, one of the things that we talked about is the assessment. Now, if we want to get to a certain point to achieve our objectives and fulfill all our requirements, we need to understand where we are. And too often, what I see is that assessment is done in a too short of a period of time. We just quickly say, oh, it's a mess, and we just need to clean up the mess. So we know where we want to be, so let's just start creating the future. Well, it's important to understand where you are. We don't want to miss out on activities that need to be done, and we don't want to be redundant. We don't want to spend time on things that don't need to change. So assessing where you are is key to being successful and maximizing that value of your ITSM implementation. So also, where do you want to be? So we talked about that a little bit. Like, what are now the targets that you want to achieve? What is our vision? What is our objective? Make those clear. If an organization has no clear objectives and doesn't have clear targets, and that means that any target you shoot at you will hit. But it may, in the end, not provide the benefits that IT is looking for, and maybe most certainly not the benefits that the business is looking for. So take your time up front to be very clear on where you want to be. So where are we and where we want to be, and that will lead you then to a roadmap on how do we get there. And this is an example of a roadmap that we created. And a couple of things to notice is, for one, and again, this really depends on your scope, what you're trying to achieve, but it takes time. This, for example, is a 4-year program. That doesn't mean that the project is 4 years. We chopped it up in pieces. So you see there's 3 phases, and then all these phases have 2 to 4 what we call waves of implementation of certain type of processes. And then the other thing that you notice here also is that some of these processes are touched more than once during this whole roadmap. It's very key and important to understand that once let's say we start now with our first phase and our first wave, that when we start working on incident and change management, that in that first project, we are not achieving the ultimate end goal of where we want to be with incident and change. I always compare it with my children going to school. I would love to send my 6-year-old to university and make them understand E is MC squared, but we have to start at elementary. We have to start with the basics of 2 + 2 = 4. And that is what we're also doing with this roadmap. Instead of trying to create the ultimate end goal, we have to give the organization the opportunity to basically grow towards that vision and towards that state. So we have to start with elementary. So we start with a basic incident management. Let's get things recorded. Let's have a process and a procedure that tells me step by step what needs to happen. And then later on, we will start optimizing the things where we touch the process for the second time. And then the third time, we can start aligning it with the real business processes that we have out there. So we go from, like we said here, from operational monitoring, so controlling the kitchen, or monitoring the kitchen, to operational control, that we have control over the kitchen, to then do service control, where we now, at the end of the 4-year program, we have a full control and we have a full ability to manage services rather than processes and technology. So we have to consider that in our approach. Try not to fix world hunger or boil the ocean in the first project that you're embarking on when we implement ITSM. Now, some of these elements that we need to assess, again, most organizations will focus on the process. So what are the core processes that we're going to address? So we want to know what is happening today, what are the things that are not working right and need to be improved, but also make sure that we capture the things that are working all right and that they don't want to see changed. And we want to keep those, although they may not be in line with the best practices book, but it is best practices for the organizations. So we, in the assessment, we want to identify, execute your processes, and support your processes. So we need to look at the skills and the experience and how that's going to match up with the future state. So where are the gaps? And the other part that we often forget about during an assessment is how is the organization being managed? Is that done in an effective and efficient way? Because when we change from a technology-oriented organization to a service-focused organization, we sometimes have to change the way we manage these things. Now, also the product, so the applications. So what are all the tools? We said it earlier in the challenge, in the challenges part. What are some of these applications that are going to be replaced by our processes that we are going to put in place? And what we often see when we start with the first initial ITSM program, that we also have a tool selection for an ITSM tool that will help us to manage all these processes. So what are all these products that we have out there that will be replaced or that we need to integrate with, whether it's within IT or whether it's with the business? And last but not least, we have potentially partners that we work with. Now those partners have to align themselves also with how we want to operate, how we want to deliver services and execute our processes. So they need to be involved as well. And what is the current state of our partners? How is that working for you? And what are the gaps and what do we need to improve? So that was the assessment piece. The other thing that needs attention, and again, this is only valid when you also are looking for a tool implementation or a tool replacement, is then the ITSM tool partner engagement. And so when we decide that we need to have a new tool and you want to do a tool vendor selection, start looking for what are initially the 5, 6 ITSM tool vendors that we would consider, that we would send an RFI to and potentially an RFP. And some of the questions that you have to ask yourself up front is, do we want a cloud solution or do we just want to have a traditional environment? The other thing when we decide to go into the cloud is, do we then want a public or private? All these things you have to think about way up front before you even start thinking about implementing a process. So this is all part of the preparation of an ITSM program. And then last but not least, when we have a third party, a tool partner that we are engaging with, is when the contract is being drafted, somebody that has some skills, some experience with processes, and what we're actually trying to achieve as a business has to do with contract review. What we see often is that these agreements with vendors are very technology focused and very tool focused, and that's basically what they're there for. But what we would like to see is that the contract itself doesn't hurt us as an organization to achieve our goal from a process perspective. And because service delivery is, we all understand that, is more than just the tool that supports the process, it's all the things around it. And contractually, we have to make sure that the partner supports us with that, and not it's just, hey, the tool is buzzing, so we're done, we're out of here. So we want to make sure that all the elements that are there from the process perspective, people perspective, that they're also covered in that agreement. So a contract review is always recommended by us to have that done. Now another element to focus on is, although most organizations have a project organization and a project management office, is to think about an ITSM program that is more than just an application implementation. Like this is like I said earlier, really in reorganizing your IT department. There's a lot more involved with that than just new functionalities or a new application for the business. And this is what you see is an example of how we approach that. This is a standard example. Again, this is not the golden bullet, but these are some of the elements to think about and make sure that we have those represented in our project organization. Right? So we see the steering committee and the executive sponsor, but we have a quality review board that basically checks all the deliverables. Are the deliverables in line with our business objectives and our IT objectives and the vision and the mission that we have? So will it support that? If not, we may have to revisit that. And then underneath there, in the middle, you can see process, research, and design. So we need to have our business analysts that analyze what we currently do and how will it look like in the future. And most importantly, what we talked about, some of those challenges, is include user groups from the organization and stakeholders in that group as well. Let them be part of some design workshops. Let them be part of validation workshops. So they can also become change champions and have a full understanding of what you're doing before we go live. And they can also explain that to other parts of the organization. So make them supporters of you rather than basically people that have no clue what you're doing and then become resistant to your program. Other things to consider, like I said, organizational change is very important. Most companies don't spend any attention to that, or some just spend not enough time on it. So changing people's behavior really is the most important thing that we're trying to achieve. It's relatively simple to get the processes in place. It's relatively simple to get the tool in place. But making people to use it the way that we have envisioned it, that is one of the toughest things that organizations struggle with. So we want to see also a group that is specifically supporting the tool, that they're dedicated to that. And what we want to see is a group that is looking at reporting. So make sure that up front we consider a group of people that start tying those critical success factors and key performance indicators and metrics that will support my objectives and the targets that I set, that they will start thinking about, so how will I report from that? So what are the data elements that are needed that then need to be included in my process design? Again, this is one of the ways to set up a project organization. And later on, we'll see the ongoing support organization and how those two will tie together. Now, when you do your project tracking, there's two key elements. And again, it sounds very straightforward, but yet every time when I walk into an organization, we have a program, there is challenges with this because we don't plan ahead of it. We try to figure it out as we go along. But think about the budgeting. So make sure that you set up your business case, that you develop a budget, for example, by deliverable, and then make sure that you have a procedure in place on how you administer that, how you will report it and monitor that, and also how we will make decisions. What if it becomes more expensive? Who needs to be involved with that decision making, and how are we going to incorporate that decision then into the project? And the other side is, of course, the schedule itself. Right? So make sure you have a good project schedule where we monitor the progress and maintain the planning of it, and make sure again that when we do scope changes on a good decision-making process around that, and that we have a good evaluation of how that impacts our project and how we will incorporate that in all the daily activities that happen. So a good project tracking, again, key is upfront. Think about how we will track schedule and how we will track the budget. Another element is what we call then the project scope and context schema. So we've done an assessment. We know where we are. We know where we want to be. So then we need to decide, well, what is going to be in scope then of a project? What are the things that we will address? And like you saw in the roadmap, also think about when will we address those then. So which processes will be in scope and when will we address them? And we'll see the same elements coming back as the assessment. So when we understand which process and when, well, who will be impacted by that? Who needs to be involved with that and when? And then which applications will be impacted by that? When will they need to be converged? When will they need to be integrated? And which partners will be impacted and when. So we need to create a project scope up front. So we have kind of a high-level deployment roadmap that we can start managing our stakeholders and the people involved in the IT organization and the business. And what we also need to create then is what we call the context schema. So basically, when we did an assessment of all the applications that we have in our organization that in some way, shape, or form perform some functionalities of a process, then we will identify whether or not those applications will be replaced, and they need to be retired, if we will have an automated integration or a manual integration to the ITSM tool that we have in place or going to put in place, or if there's no need for an integration at all, that it just will be two separate systems or multiple separate systems. When we do this up front, this helps a lot, again, with getting people on board, rather than while we're running the project, all of a sudden start trying to pull people in that are owners of these applications, and then we have to bring up to speed of what the program is, why we're doing this, and again, it's not that they're not having a day job as well. So before the start of the program, having this work done will help you get some buy-in, get a good understanding, and reduce the resistance of, in this case, also application owners. What this also does is it helps you with some cost justification. Right? In this case, you can see that there's a lot of tools that will be replaced or retired, but there's some cost savings on the licenses and maintenance side, and that typically is a good return on investment that you can show in your initial phases of the program. Like I said, we have a little bit of project plan. Key for this, at least what I find important, again, there's multiple ways of creating a project plan, but when we look at the process side on the bottom, I always try to divide it in those 5 elements. There's an assessment piece, and then there's a clear cut into we're designing it. Once we're done with the design, we go to a transition, and then we go to an early live support. We have it in operations. And then while we're running it in operations, we will start our process improvement, and we do that on a lean IT basis. So periodically we will look at what are the things that are not running as expected, how will we improve them, and we do this in a periodic bi-weekly or monthly basis. Now, with the project, we also need to track, and there's a couple of things that are essential to track. One we talked about is risks, and not only listing the risk, but make sure that we have a process behind, a procedure behind it to manage those risks, assign them to owners, and make sure that these people follow up with the risk before they become issues. Track all the actions that are tied to a project plan. So if we say that we need to do a technical design as a line item, well, what are then the specific actions? And list the people that you have to interact with, so we can start planning and we understand what the resource allocation is. So we can, for the people that are not 100% on the project, we can see when will they be available to do what task. So we can plan our project accordingly. Of course, some risks will turn into issues, so we have to track the issues as well. And very key is to log the decisions that have been made. So make sure that you record every decision that is made in the program, who was part of the decision making, and what the justification was for the decision. This will truly help you to not talk about the same issues over and over again, or the same elements that we need to take care of. When we had the discussion 2 months ago, it is very normal, especially in a larger project, that some people who were not part initially of that decision, they come up with a similar idea or a similar concern, and we'll start that discussion again. If we have it documented, they can just refer back to that document, and they can see what happened and what the decision eventually was. Have a list of all the interfacing projects and programs, right? And set up regular communication between those programs and project and your program. So we basically give information both ways, right? We receive it from the other programs and we give it to them, so we stay aligned with each other and we don't step on each other's toes. Document all your assumptions that we make, and also specifically document all the things that are out of scope. Right? So we clearly want to say, well, this is not something that we're going to take care of. So it is linked also to decisions, so we don't rehash it all the time. Well, maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. So document what is out of scope, and we want to pull something that was out of scope in scope. Well, then we go back to what is the impact to the project? How will it impact my budget? How will it impact my schedule? So we typically have a template for that. If you don't have one, feel free to email us later, and we're more than happy to share the template with you on how we typically track all of these items. Now we talked about the project structure, so what we also have is the organizational structure. And you will see that it looks very similar. And we did that on purpose. What we like to achieve is that once the project or a project phase is done, that there's a seamless rollover to the ongoing support organization. That we don't have to change the structure every time, and people have to get used to a new hierarchy, a new reporting structure. No, it's seamlessly just moving from one side to the other. So on the right side, you see a replica of that project structure in our ongoing support organization. Because in the end, I know in the beginning it will be a lot of project, but once we go through that whole roadmap, more and more emphasis will be on the ongoing support. But in the ongoing run organization, there will be a need for modifications. We do have the continual process improvement. So we will have that structure. We keep that structure in place. And now it's tied to the left side of the service management office. That is what we would refer to as the run organization. So these are basically that's the side that is responsible for the operations. So we see our owners, we see the reporting, and then the operational people that execute these processes. So now we're tied to reporting to one entity in the service management office, so we can tie improvements, so the build, the plan and the build, we can tie that back to our run organization in one seamless organization. Now, when we create this ongoing support organization, again, this is just an example. It's not the only way to do this, but when you design it, start really early with this. Like I said, you may not finish this before we start with the program, but make sure that in the first couple of months that you come up and finalize with the design and finalize that, because it is key to get all these people in place. Right? Again, we need to start thinking about training. We need to start thinking about shifting people from one group to another. So we need to do an estimate of FTEs and the resources that we have available. Do we have them in-house? Do we need to find them on the outside? The ownership needs to be assigned very early, because the sooner and process owner can be part of the program, the better it is for them to understand and to be supportive and also help with the design and transition of these processes. The organizational context needs to be considered. Right, so what are the current roles and responsibilities? There's organizations that have a plan, build, run structure. There's organizations that don't have that, but it makes a huge difference on how you set up a service management office. Also, where do you put the decision rights? So who can decide, for example, on the design of the process or on how we report on the process? So where do we put those decision rights? And then, is it a global organization versus a regional versus local? When you have local, then you need to find a way, how can we make it not bureaucratic, that every decision has to be made at the global level, but what can we push down to a local level? What can they decide there without harming the overall process objectives and organizational objectives that we achieve? And then, of course, we have to, for every design that we come up with, we have to assess the costs and the risks. So what are the pros and the cons of all those options that we have on the table? But the real important is that we do this in a fairly early stage. You don't want to go live in an organization without having this in place, because then we have a tool, we have processes, but they're not being managed the way we want them to be managed. So this is very key. The other important thing that we talked about was organizational change, attitude, behavior, and culture. So put a lot of emphasis on that. I cannot stress that too much. Right, so we need to analyze the organization. How is it currently working? How we need to unfreeze it and reconfigure, and that means that we need to think about training of people. We need to redocument some scripts that they use, some standard operating procedures, and then we need to refreeze. So basically, that analyze, unfreeze, reconfigure, and refreeze is the organizational change that we make. How can we change people's behavior going from A to B? And what we need to do is really make an assessment. When we talk about communication and training, it's really not a one-size-fits-all. There's a couple of dynamics there. We, for one, have a strategic, a tactical, and operational layer. But we also have people that are ready to learn. They are willing, but maybe not completely able, so they need some training, they need some guidance. And then there's people that are ready for change. They are able, they are willing. So we may not have to put a lot of emphasis and put a lot of effort in these people to get them up to speed and get them to do what they want to do, what we need them to do. But then there's people that are ready for resistance, and then there's people that are ready for frustration. And they need to be addressed in a different way. So that is very important to kind of group people in your organization so you can understand how you will communicate with them in a different way and how you will train them differently. So in the end, we get most of those people on board and we're all getting ready for change. So we want to do a stakeholder assessment. That's also important. Right? When we talk about those benefits and what we're trying to achieve, also find out for each stakeholder what makes them tick, what is important for them, and then find the things that you do in your program that will support what they find important, and then communicate on that and show them those benefits and what you're doing for that. So train them or create awareness, and again, communicate to them what they find important. If there's something that is not important for them, you think it's important for you, maybe still not a good idea to communicate that. So stakeholder management, who are in support of you, who are resistant, those is a very key activity to perform before we start our program. So all of that information, we create a solid communication plan and tie that then back to your roadmap that you have, your project plan. So it's all about communicating the right thing at the right time to the right people using the right media. And again, consider the fact that we have strategic, tactical, and operational levels, and all of these people want to be addressed differently. The same then for a training plan. It's the same principle. Understand we have strategic, tactical, and operational, and find out what people already know. Don't spend time with them, wasting their time basically trying to teach them what they already know, but spend then also some more time with people that needs to learn, that are not as able yet, or frustrated or resistant. So spend more time and teach them in a different way. And last but not least, also the program status. Also there, we need to do some good reporting and show the benefits to the organization. And again, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Understand here also that we have a strategic, tactical, and operational level. And how people on an operational level need to be informed about what's going on is different than on a strategic level. When you want to report to your CIO or your CFO, they want to see different information than the people that are down in the weeds trying to fix problems and issues. So give it some time and some thought before we start the program on how we're going to do this. Because also when we put it in place, we don't want to change this every 2 weeks and provide them with some new format and new layout. We want to keep that consistent so it's easy for them also to compare on what's going on in the last couple of months with this program. Again, these are some of the examples that we again, that is very useful for me, that I always use and I always try to pay attention to, that makes these implementations, these programs, go a little bit smoother. And in the end, when you prepare well, means that your project and your program goes a lot smoother and better. We have a better result. So it really, in the end, maximizes the value of ITSM during the when we're in operations. So yeah, that was it, Alex. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, we actually do have a couple here. We have a couple people saying thank you as well, so we also say thank you for joining us today. The first question we have here, Adrian, is who does the service management organization fall under typically? Would it be the CIO?
The CIO is what we typically recommend in the end. If we can do that from the start, that would be great.